All right, Mary, go ahead.
Thanks, Anna. Hello and welcome. This is our final webinar in our summer series for our forum partners from the University of Tennessee Global Supply Chain Institute. We are so happy that you've joined us today. This is, really came out of the concept of trying to find opportunity in difficulty. And we have great speakers with us today. I'm here, Mary Long. I'm the managing director of our forum, and I've got a few housekeeping items to go over with you before we start the webinar. So please note that all attendees will be muted, and you'll use the Q&A function on your Zoom control panel to submit questions for the panelists. Like our events at the forum, you can upvote questions in the queue, and we encourage you to use the chat function to participate in the discussion. We'll also conduct some live polling, which will all be anonymous. And if you have questions for our tech team, please use the chat or send an email to the gsci@utk.edu versus using the Q&A. We have some information posted here, and Hannah will copy and paste this into the chat as well in case you need to dial in. After the webinar, you'll receive an email tomorrow with links to the recording and to the slide deck. It is now my extreme pleasure to introduce our speakers for today, two of our very own supply chain management department faculty. And so probably don't even need this introduction, but Chad Autry is our department head and the FedEx Corporation Endowed Professor of Supply Chain Management and the Martin and Jean Mills Faculty Research Fellow, and just a wonderful guy. And Cole Burns is our Director of Supply Chain Career Management. And many of you, if you do not already know Cole and have not already connected with them on all things related to connecting with students and networking and scholars of distinction, then you will after this webinar for sure. So I'm going to hand it off to Cole and Chad, and I will go off mic and you will see me at the end of the webinar. Thanks everyone. Bye guys.
Good afternoon, everybody. Thanks for attending this afternoon. I'm here with my friend and colleague, Cole Burns, and we wanted to spend some time with everyone today talking about Generation Z in the supply chain workplace. And so Cole and I approach this in a couple of different ways. I approach it as an academic department head at UT, where I get to interact every semester with hundreds of students that are all, kind of wondering what's it going to be like out there when they graduate, and how can they find the best position. And they're, they and their parents come to me and they're very concerned about, well, are there jobs in supply chain that would be good for me? And so we spend a lot of time answering those calls and emails, and Cole, I'll let you talk a moment about your role, but Cole plays a kind of an integral part in that process, and that he helps manage supply chain students' careers.
Yeah, thanks, Chad. So yeah, my role is split between a few different things, but the areas I spend the most time on is I work with our supply chain forum partners, helping them get on campus and get involved with our students in front of students, and just building their brand at UTK a little bit more. But then my favorite part is I get to work one-on-one with students, helping them figure out what it is they really enjoy, what they really love, what types of jobs they're interested in, and helping coach them through their career decision-making process.
So I'll begin with a little bit of a story that came to us. We were in the context of the supply chain forum. We interact with lots of different businesses and professionals from all across the supply chain landscape. And there was a moment in time a couple of years ago when I was working on some research having to do with the kind of the people side of supply chain management. And like Cole says, a lot of the supply chain workforce is newer workers. It's people that are recently graduated from university. So I'm at this Fortune 100 manufacturing company. That's not an actual picture there of them, but it's illustrative of the kind of place I was at. And we were talking about actually procurement at the moment, and talking about their annual spend. And I said, well, so what's your spend every year, and how does that look? And they said, well, we're 94 million in direct materials, we're 42 million in indirect expenses. And I said, so what do you spend on human capital? and how does that play into your resourcing? And they said, well, we spend probably on recruitment, retention, development of people, probably $8 million, something like that. And my reaction was, well, that's interesting because we talk a lot about in organizations like ours that people are our most important asset, but the amount we spend on people isn't really even a tenth of what we spend on materials. And so there's sort of a disconnect there. And my conclusion when I left the meeting was that in this organization, like many others, we sort of begin to at some point in time to assume talent. And that we spend a lot of time going global to find our next source of raw materials, or we may look around the world in source of new source locations or source companies, but we don't spend nearly as much time on human capital as we do the other types of capital in our organization. So I kind of put this hypothesis out there and began to think about it. And as I talked to other people, it occurred to me that we may be in a little bit of a way, sort of deceiving ourselves. And the mandatory Dilbert that comes in here sort of shows my thoughts about it, where the boss says, I've been saying for years that employees are our most valuable asset. And it turns out I was wrong. Money's our most valuable asset. Employees come in ninth, and carbon paper, I guess, comes in a little bit ahead of that. But the joke being that, that companies don't nearly invest the level of effort or resources to build a talent supply chain that they do the supply chains for other things that they have. And so I find that to be, as a person who's in the talent business, is the way I sort of view Cole and I find that to be a little shocking. And so we have begun over the course of time to kind of begin to ask ourselves the question, well, why is that? And so what Cole and I will present to you today is some sort of anecdotal research. That research speaks to some of the issues that surround the supply chain for talent, but particularly as pertains to the generation of talent that's kind of currently coming out of our institution right now and others like ours, which is Generation Z. And so our first question that we want to ask you before we get into Generation Z is, how does your company treat employees, and how do you think of them? So we're popping up a poll question right now, and so we'd like for you to kind of use those answers there. Does your company treat employees as their most valuable asset? And if you can click yes, or well, we're trying, or we say we do but we don't practice it, or people matter but they aren't as important as other things. And so if you'd like, go ahead and take a few seconds to fill that in, and we'll give you about 15 seconds to do that. And Cole will run the poll.
I'll give you guys another 5 seconds or so to answer that if you haven't already. We'll go ahead and close that in 3, 2, 1. Awesome. So as you can see, it looks like a majority of you are saying that they're trying, which I mean is great that they're trying, but obviously shows they could do a little bit more there.
It's interesting that, Cole, it's interesting to me that 17% said, people matter, but they're not as important as other things. Mm-hmm. I actually am eager to talk to those people. If at the end of this webinar you're still around because you found it interesting enough to stick around, it'd be great to have some Q&A that involved that group. So let's go ahead and push the poll forward there.
Sounds good.
So some things that we've been thinking about as we progress through this. One of those things, as we've been kind of studying the subject, is that part of the human resource quandary in SCM has to do with SCM itself. Next generation supply chain talent is a little bit maybe more complicated than we in the university and even professionals out there have given it credit for. One thing that I hear a lot about from our recent graduates, and I think Cole's research backs this up as well, is that the roles that our students go into are pretty complex. They come out and they're asked to wear many hats, or they go through a management training program early on, and they have lots of different experiences early in career. And that's good, because as we'll see later on in the webinar, that our students are looking for things, are looking for many opportunities early on. But because the roles are complex, and because employees have lots of choice, and because of a third factor, which we'll talk about just for a moment, which is that businesses are currently trying to figure out, well, what roles should I keep and what roles should I automate? What should I hand over to artificial intelligence or robotics or whatever it might be? we are sort of struggling at this moment to kind of define what is the best supply chain human resource. What's the best widget that a factory like the University of Tennessee can create for your businesses? And so as we continue to think about that in the near future, we're going to be kind of thinking about that in terms of how do goals and visions and values of hiring managers align or fit with those who are being hired. Because ideally, we would come up with a human resource mix at a place like this, at a place like UT, that would meet the needs of our customers. And we're famous here for saying that our customers are our industry partners, our students are our very best products, and so in order to serve you best, what we need to do is we need to align the capabilities and the attitudes and the goals and the values of our products with those of the people they're going to work with. But it's a little more complicated than a lot of people sort of can assume. So and we're calling these chasms, I guess. Maybe they're not always chasms. Maybe there's sometimes just little gaps. But I suppose that we need to go into and try to sort of discover what it is that is causing misalignment, if there is any. Because to be truthful, we are hearing things out of our graduating students that sometimes bewilder us a little bit. The students say, these jobs might have been good for my older brother and sister or my parents, but they're not as good for me. And so we're asking a lot of questions. So why is that? And so, because we want to keep our finger on the pulse of the practitioner community and try to provide the best possible output. So a question for us to then kind of consider as we go through this endeavor and as we were thinking about this research was, how can companies like yours construct a talent supply chain that's just like your product and services supply chain in many ways, that can deliver maximum value to your industry stakeholders, to you and to your partners? And drilling down into that, a short and easy answer, of course, is we'll do the same things in our talent supply chain that we do in our regular one. We'll identify and procure the best raw materials. We'll convert those to the highest quality assets possible. We'll ideally prevent those assets from migrating to the competition, but we'll begin to kind of eat our own dog food a little bit and build a supply chain that's similar to the one that we use for everything else. That makes sense in a way, but in this era of students, and Cole, I'll ask you to talk about this for a second, but the third of these may be the hard one, because we are seeing now that students come out kind of with the intention of having a couple of jobs early in the career. What's your reaction to that?
Yeah, no, I think there's a culture now where students expect to not spend more than 2 years in their first job. I know I've heard from a few alumni that have only been out like a year and a half, 2 years already, like in the last few months, saying like, I've gotten good at my job. Now I am thinking I'm ready for the next step. Like, what should I do? And I think it probably comes from them not being challenged enough in their current position, or they don't feel like they're being challenged enough or given those opportunities to grow. Because then at the same time, I've seen plenty of companies, hire in alumni of ours who then will like bring them through just the gamut of different positions and be training them to do, basically end-to-end supply chain within their own organization. And they're usually the ones who want to stay a little bit longer because they're constantly learning something new and being challenged.
Yeah, and so I do think that is going to be one of the big issues is how can we create better early career alignment? And so that was what was really driving this as we kind of went through. Before I get to the answer to that question, I want to go ahead and take the automation bit off the table. This hopefully just takes a minute or two. There are thoughts that I've been getting back from my conversations with business people that say, well, we're a little bit frozen about how to do jobs right now in certain ways, because there are some of our jobs that we plan on automating away in the next 5 to 7 years. And particularly as we've looked at the way organizations have evolved since we've all been hit with this coronavirus for the last several months, it's becoming more and more evident that some of the things that we've been doing with people, we can begin to think about doing in other ways without people. And so a few observations I have on that, and I just want to put those out there so that we can kind of take this off the table for the moment. Automation is going to happen. And in fact, there's going to be probably an automation revolution in the next decade that's going to really cause us to rethink the role of people in organizations. But one thing to consider is that though it is indeed happening, and you can't afford to tolerate anybody in your ranks saying that it isn't, there's a couple of kind of big thoughts about this and that we need to kind of inhale before we just run to automate. And the first one is, if you look there on the left, manufacturing output has been outgrowing job growth, and this through the early part of this decade. And if I were to continue this graph out further, because BLS doesn't have another one, it actually widens even a little bit further. And as we have seen in the last few months, jobs have gone away, but production hasn't fallen at the rate that jobs have fallen off. So one of the things that we have to begin to kind of inhale here is that it is in fact reasonable to think that many things that we have people doing right now could be better done by a machine or an application in the near future. And I often also hear somebody, if you look at the graph on the right, I often hear people say, well, the reason that the jobs are going away is not because of automation. They're going away because they are being offshored, or they're being taken by illegal immigrants or something like that. And that's actually not true either. Ball State University did some research on this in the decade previous to this one, and found that most of the job loss came from automation, and about an even level, according to BLS, is happening at this current time. So first point is that there's a little bit of a decoupling going on here, but it's a decoupling that's happening because we're using technology. And so then the second rule then is, well, what should we automate? And so without going too deep into it, looking at the graph on the left, a lot of people believe that the things that we should be automating are the things that are manual. So if it's manual labor, it's risky, it's potentially dangerous. I should be thinking about automating that. But as it turns out, in best practice, at least so far, through the early part of this last decade, there was beginning to be an effect shown for non-routine versus manual. And so if you think about the things that you really want to automate, you want to automate things that you do over and over again in an identical way. And so what are the things that we do in supply chain identically every time? Well, I mean, very basic forecasts, very basic, if we're in procurement, very basic contract design and things like that. Even to the point where we're doing tax preparation and things of that nature in an automated way. In the warehouse, it's driving, or it's warehouse picking in logistics. And so we've got some things that we do the same way every time, and we've got different variants of those things, as you can see below, that are different every time you do them. And so it really comes down to, in automation, the non-routine is the thing that seems like we ought to be doing in a technologically infused sort of way. So we need to rethink a little bit the relationship between job roles and job tasks. What are those jobs that need to be done by a human? What are the ones that need to be done by a machine? And how can we create a mix of those that makes a lot of sense? And McKinsey says even more recently that, we kind of back it, and it kind of backs up what we were just saying, that machines aren't very good at everything yet. They're plenty good at anything that has to do with data collection or data processing or very predictable physical work. But they're not so good yet at managing people or creating expertise, et cetera. We're getting there on that front as well, if you've been paying attention to some of the evolution and supercomputers and things of that nature, but we're not there just yet. And so that leads to rule number 3, which is, I think we need to begin to imagine what the next jobs are going to look like. When I was born, in 1970, a bunch of the jobs that exist today didn't exist back then. And in fact, if you look at this, there are jobs on the left there that existed in 1950 but didn't exist in 2001. And then in 2001, we had things like app developers and chief listening officers and wind farm engineers coming onto the scene. And so the question is, what is it going to be that we have next? And so that's the role that our students here hopefully will play, is they will fill those next jobs, the ones that are non-routine, that are highly cognitive, and that are supply chain focused across multiple organizations, probably, that are going to be the ones that don't get automated. So with that, I'm going to kick it to my friend Cole here, and we're going to talk a little bit about what we've been doing here at UT just for a minute, even though many of you here are aware, because we have some perspectives from our talent base that I think are worth sharing.
Yeah, thanks, Chad. So yeah, as we were just talking about, we need a slew of different talent to be able to fulfill the gaps that we're going to be seeing as automation arises, and as we're just progressing into the future. And so we have a range of programs, from our undergrad program, different masters, executive education, that we use in order to develop tomorrow's talent today, right? So that we can be preparing students, preparing professionals to be able to move into roles at your companies in the most effective way possible. So just a little bit of information about our program. We have approximately 1,300 undergraduate students. It's the largest program at UT, and it's just grown exponentially over the last couple of years. And especially with supply chain being so prevalent in the news, we see that as kind of a continued trend going forward. And we also have approximately 200 graduate students in our various programs, whether it's an MBA with a supply chain concentration, our Masters of Global Supply Chain Management, or a Masters of Supply Chain Management online program. And because of that, we're graduating about 440 grads per year. So trying to provide as much talent as possible to you guys as quickly as we can. And as you can see, we have approximately an 89% placement rate at 60 days after graduation. And luckily that's for this year. I know I was a little concerned. We're usually around like the 90-93% threshold at this point, but I was very glad to see that in the midst of COVID. And then our students are looking for roles all over the place. I know Chad mentioned earlier, students really like to be challenged, to be able to see different opportunities. And so I know one of the more common things I see is students are looking for development programs where they're able to rotate in and out of various jobs and be able to really learn what it is they like about supply chain, because it is so broad. But in some recent reports from our seniors from this last year, you can kind of see the breakdown of the types of roles students are looking for, whether it's in planning, transportation, consulting, et cetera. And then something important, I mean, I'm sure the reason you're all here is you're realizing Gen Z is coming into the workforce now. A majority of our students are Gen Z already. A lot of the ones who just graduated are Gen Z. Of course, there's some non-traditional college students that still fit into the Generation Y category. But we have that generation coming up and going into internships this summer and into full-time jobs right now and going forward. So one of the questions I get a lot about our program is in regard to diversity. I know most employers say, you know, we want to recruit diverse students. How do we do that? And something pretty exciting is the university has a strong commitment to increasing diversity initiatives across the board right now. And the Housing College of Business recently launched our diversity action plan, and they're going to be rolling that out over the next year. I could talk about this for probably a full hour, but instead I'm going to focus in a little bit on goals number 3 and 4, since they pertain to you all a little bit. So we're going to be doing increased programming, targeting underrepresented populations, focusing on career and professional development. And then at the same time, we're going to be trying to foster partnerships that have a focus on diversity and inclusion, including creating workshops for employers to be able to learn, you know, what is it like to actually recruit and retain diverse students, because that's something this upcoming generation cares about too, even if they themselves might not fit into an underrepresented population category. They care that the company they're going into cares about that and is actively pursuing creating a more welcoming environment. So what makes SCM talent development unique and challenging? I'm sure you all know it is a broad field, and there are a lot of different things you can do with it. And it's pretty diverse just with the types of jobs you can get. I know it's always really interesting when I meet with a freshman who is like, well, what is a supply chain job? What can I do? And I basically say, you know, almost anything. Like there's a lot of different areas you can go into. And so it's challenging because you need to be skilled both relationally and technically. And that's why we focus, you know, on end-to-end supply chain as well too, so that our students are prepared to go into anything rather than just one niche area. And as you know, as we've all seen over these last few months, especially, is supply chain thought's quickly changing. You know, the needs that we're seeing are very, very rapidly growing. And I think it's interesting too, because, you know, even on the point of automation, like we've seen recently that the need for someone who's a critical thinker, who can do more than just a machine can, is super important. And so being able to identify and recruit and retain those talented SCM folks is, you know, key for your organization. Chad, if you want to go on to that next point for me. So one of the biggest issues that I see all the time, especially when talking with seniors and alumni who, have just gone into a new role or who are trying to navigate picking a new role, is finding candidates and people that match people and the types of roles that they're going into. So finding that fit is really important to students. They're not just focused on money or location or anything like that. Like, they want to know that they're actually going to fit in well with the organization, and cultures become that much more of an important piece in their job search. Chad, is there anything you would want to add to that?
No, it's just that that last little point there, that when we are seeing that there's misalignment and the students are reporting that misalignment, it seems to be coming from one of a couple sources, and that's what we're going to kind of linger on for the rest of the presentation. And that is it's a misalignment across value systems, and a particular couple of things come to mind as I say that. One is that there seems to be a little bit of a value system chasm between what students today are expecting out of a job role and what prior generations that are doing the hiring might have considered to be appealing. And so there's a little bit of almost an advertising gap going on sometimes in the hiring process, where some organizations are not marketing their roles to the students in the ways that the students want to hear them. And so part of what we want to do is, with this presentation, is sort of clean up some of that by showing you some examples of good practice in doing that. And another thought that sort of strikes me is that sometimes the person doing the recruiting is not the same person that's doing the hiring. And so the recruiter there's also a gap maybe internally to the hiring organization where there's a little bit of a misalignment between the recruiter's vision of what a future employee might look like coming out of Gen Z and what a more senior person's vision of good characteristics of an employee might be. And so with those two things in mind, then we'll go ahead and we're going to do a few things here. First thing we want to do is we need to give out some definitions so that we can talk about generations in a way that makes a lot of sense. And so I'm going to just give you some textbook characteristics to chew on here. You can argue kind of around the boundaries of when each generational group actually began to exist, and of course they sort of bleed over onto one another. Many people might say that if you're kind of in your older 30s right now or young 40s, you're somewhat of a mix of X and Y, for example. And we have students that are in their kind of early 20s that have a lot of Y characteristics with some Z thrown in. But this is a casual way of looking at generations and sort of how we'll define them as we go through the process. One thing that's kind of interesting to highlight is the X and Y groups represent roughly 70% of the workforce right now, but most organizations are led by boomers or senior X's, and most of the new hires are Z's. And so as you begin to kind of think about the problems that might create when an executive vision is translated into a Z-level hire, it seems sensible to us to kind of begin to think about how can we distill down what gaps exist between the people making the decisions at the upper end of the organization with those that are going to be executing those decisions down lower. So as we take these things forward, then I'm going to go ahead and knock us into a poll real quick so that we can see who we've got here today, or actually, I guess of the people that are here today, what are their hiring managers sort of classified as? If we use those age and education definitions from earlier, answer for us real quick. What generation are the hiring managers, and if the recruiters are themselves different, what generation are they? That will allow us to sort of customize the backside of this so that we can draw you the most value. So Cole, why don't you take that poll for a little bit?
Awesome. I will give people about another 10 seconds to respond here. But yeah, and like Chad mentioned, for some people that the answers might be the same. It might be the same person as your hiring manager and as your recruiter. And that's okay, but that also might be an area where there's a gap or a way that you could continue to improve your recruiting process and talent acquisition. So I will give you guys another 3 seconds or so, and then I will go ahead and close this out. All right, so it looks like roughly 78% of you are saying your hiring managers are Gen X. And in comparison, 65% are saying their recruiters or points of contact for their college programs are Gen Y or millennial, with a very small percentage of Gen X and boomer recruiters. and it doesn't look like any millennial hiring managers, which is a pretty interesting comparison there.
That is very interesting, because one of the things we're going to share here in a moment is that of all of the different chasms between different generational value sets, the greatest one is between X's and Y's, and so that's going to create some internal well, fun things to talk about inside organizations.
Yeah.
So let's go ahead and advance there. Thanks. So what I'm about to present then is some research that has been done by some sociologists that study organizations in the field of management, that begins to tap into social influences across the generations. And so we're going to put you into a scenario here where we're talking about a hiring manager that is a boomer, X or Y, and because you replied that it was that most of the hiring managers here were X's, we'll use the XZ comparison most frequently. But I want to show you some of the things that org sociologists have been learning about this, just because I think it's really interesting for our purposes today. Let's begin by understanding who the boomers are and why they are who they are, and I'll go through this relatively quickly. They're born in 46 through 64, so they were among the first generation of people that watched television frequently. And if you watch the first fictional television shows that were on back then, they almost always depicted strong nuclear families. So shows like Donna Reed and et cetera. And so boomers grew up with a value that the nuclear family was to be held in high prestige, and it was to be treasured. At the same time, during their formative years, we had some things that go on that really inspired a lot of American patriotism and exceptionalism, and the moon landing is perhaps the greatest of those. We had some crises as well, the Cuban Missile Crisis, et cetera. But if you think about the formative years of boomers, it was mostly about economic prosperity. It was mostly about American can-do, and there were a few threats in that environment that made the boomers a little bit nervous. And the biggest ones, because of their value for nuclear families, was that something would happen to those families as a result of either war, because Vietnam played prominently in their thought processes, and it was a time when people worried a lot about that and whether they would be asked to go serve. And then, of course, there was the sexual revolution of the late 1960s that sort of began to tear at the nuclear family values that they'd grown up with earlier. At the same time that we had some prominent assassinations in the United States and other bad things go on that sort of shook our national cohesion a little bit. And so if you take that as a whole, the boomers were socialized as kind of optimists with strong morals and work ethics, but also believed in formal hierarchies which would protect us from harm. Well, they transferred those values over onto their organizational lives. And so many boomers that exist in organizations today believe in things such as a formal organizational hierarchy, that the person at the top makes the decisions and the people below sort of execute on those decisions. And so as we'll see as we progress through the generations, that can create a little bit of misalignment when you begin to think about all of those things can create a little bit of misalignment when you think about how it is you're going to bring on new people into your workplace. So then we'll go on to X. I'll try to keep it quick again. This is me, by the way, and so I feel like this resonates a lot with me when I started doing the research. I was a latchkey kid. I was one of the first generation where the nuclear family was replaced by a mother working in the outside workplace, and so I stayed home and I watched MTV and I saw Beavis and Butthead disrespecting their parents, and there was this weakening of the nuclear family during my generation we didn't see in the previous one. I was a little bit formed by Watergate, not that much, but I was much more formed by the Cold War and the energy crises of the 70s. And because of that, my group became more skeptical and pragmatic of the U.S.'s role internationally. We were a little bit less American exceptionalists and a little bit more questioning about USA's role in the world. Because our moms were away, we had a quality of life that was, in our minds, a little bit unfair or perhaps a little deteriorated versus our older brothers and sisters. And so there was a little bit of a poor ROI on quality of life. And often I also know my friends and I were experiencing things like parents being laid off for the first time in a long time. And so there's a sense in Gen X that loyalty is a little bit one way, where the employees expected to be loyal to the organization, but the leaders are not expected to be as loyal to the employees. And that was different than our parents saw it. And so we have a little bit of a flare through us that leaders can be unethical. it's not always true. And again, we're kind of making some generalizations, but this is definitely a characteristic of X that shows up in org sociology. And so the threats that for me were divorce, so the family unit degrading even further, me being an independent person at a much younger age, and then that there'd be job loss. The baby boomers didn't worry much about job loss. They worried about getting the best position in the organization. In my generation, we thought about entrepreneurship because it was a way to ensure that jobs wouldn't be lost. Obviously, if I'm my own boss, I won't fire myself. So our socialization, and again, in general, is that X's are a little bit more skeptical. We believe in ourselves a little bit more than formal institutions, and though practical and kind of informal, we kind of live to get the job done. So if the boomers were live to work, we were a little bit more work to live. And so again, some stereotypes that will carry forward as we begin to analyze the other groups. This is, by the way, going to conflict a little bit with the Z's, as you'll see here in a moment, if the X's are hiring the Z's. Y has gotten a lot of attention in the last decade, so I won't go through a bunch of it, but there was a little bit of a latchkey backlash where parents felt a little bit of guilt about, children felt guilt about their parents being away from them, so they overcompensated by being hovering over their children a little bit as in the form of helicopter parents. And they took an advocate model of the nuclear family, which was that though the children may still be working, or the children may still be at home while parents are working, the parents are constantly making phone calls, et cetera, and organizing play dates and things of that nature to support the children while they're still in the home. This led to some non-traditional households with some family structures that were unusual to the X's and boomers. Some very child-centric homes with flat authority structures. Children were deeply involved in decision-making at earlier and earlier ages. And that decision-making came in the form of a lot of attention when the parents and children were together and a lot of positive reinforcement. Nothing wrong with any of that, but what it did do was it creates some workplace dynamics that are a little bit uncomfortable for their supervisors later on. Gen Y was influenced a lot by 9/11, so they are very patriotic and they desire to become better so they can improve the world, and they're a little bit more altruistic than the X generation was. And they were one of the first generations, or the first generation, to become internet fluent. And so the rise of digital technology gave them tools that the X's had to adapt to later, and Gen Y was very proud to grab those tools and run with them and begin to use them. And so an example I hear about this a lot is that the boomers or X senior people in an organization will go to the Ys and say, well, what is it that you really want here in the organization? And the Ys will come up with something that's a technological solution. So in one case, it was, we'd like better communication devices. We'd like to actually have an internal text intranet that we can use, and we can do everything by text versus having meetings. And that was fantastic for the Ys, and they would use it with one another in one organization we talked to. But what happened was the Ys were the only one using it at some point. And so the X's and the boomers didn't buy in. They didn't actually use the technology. So the Ys essentially became a club inside the organization, and they realized that if the boomers and the X's weren't going to use it, it wasn't any value to them either. So that it was essentially a tool that was bought for them to make them attract to the organization more, but it didn't work because there was not buy-in all the way to the top. And so the socialization here is that the Ys are hard workers that prize accomplishment, but not at the expense of work-life balance. And they value self-esteem and improvement as a result of that, their growth structure and their earlier homes over money. And so if boomers live to work and X's work to live, Ys follow their passion. And I think a lot of people in the audience would probably resonate a little bit with that. So I'll get on to Z. This is the one that we're here to talk about. And the reason we had to go through it, Boomer, X, and Y, is so we can make some comparisons that will be valuable when you begin to think about onboarding Z. Z is a different animal. And most of Z, by the way, is not even in college yet. Most of Z is actually still in high school or primary school. And so we're going to talk about Z, but some real quick things. They have a little bit of 9/11 memories and some Great Recession memories, but what they learned from the Great Recession and 9/11 is that life is short and stability is more important than anything else. And so the Z's are in tune with media. They operate on multiple screens at one time in their home. And so because of that, they have a focus on the environment and social justice that other generations haven't had. And so their socialization is one that we're talking about dedicated global citizens that prioritize stability and hard work and connectivity, and they want to change the world. And changing the world for Zs is more important in some ways than getting to the wealth or the recognition that the boomers and the Xs were hoping for. And so because of those gaps, and we need to go do a real quick exercise on stereotyping, we're going to have some gaps that we need to talk about, and I'm going to go through what those are here in just a sec. But because of those gaps, we need to do a little bit of stereotyping. And so I'll be brief and just say that, you know, when we were growing up, we were all growing up, our parents and our grandparents said, you know, don't stereotype. That's a bad thing to do, because you'll actually end up persecuting someone when you do that. We're going to talk about stereotyping today because it's necessary. And so we don't want to use the common thought that stereotyping is oversimplification or prejudice. We want to use a way of thinking about stereotyping that is much more about conforming to a fixed pattern so that we can understand. So what we're doing here is we're simply saying these are some characteristics of the Z generation that the X and Y managers need to know about. So that's the kind of stereotyping we're going to do here. So here are the value chasms, and I've got a lot of stuff on this slide. You're not expected to memorize any of it. But what I wanted to just kind of point out is some general dispositions of Z. If Z's general disposition are optimistic realists that are cultivating a personal brand, and their responsibility and time focus is all about justice and volunteerism and social responsibility, and they're structurally, they'll put up with hierarchy, but would prefer to live in more of a network or a peer-to-peer organization. And furthermore, they prefer collaboration to winners and losers, sort of like Generation Y. And furthermore, they prefer financial security over dollars, and they're very good with technology. That is going to be a profile that is very hard for a hiring X manager or a boomer manager to understand when they go into making an offer. So, Cole, I'm going to put out some criticisms of Gen Z. They are short attention span, responding. They expect instant response. They value speed more than precision, and they see gender and diversity and ethnicity very different than everybody else. But Cole, I'm going to get to the point here, which is I don't think Gen Z is being recruited the way we believe they should be recruited. So I'd like to just kind of get your general reaction to that statement. As I think that we are not doing a good job entirely of preparing Gen Z for the workplace, but I would also suggest that the workplace is not quite preparing itself for Gen Z either. What's your take?
Yeah, no, I would totally agree. I think over the past few years, especially, and you know, especially within supply chain, we really value efficiency and conformity, which are not generally what Gen Z is looking for, and especially when it comes to recruiting. And I was reading an article in Fortune the other day that was talking about how Gen Z is used to things being personalized for them. And that's just how their whole life has been. They've had things monogrammed. They have ads come up on Instagram and Twitter that are personalized to meet their needs, and they expect the same thing when they're going into the workforce. And so I've seen a lot of companies adapt like technology, where it will be the first round of interview will be just this virtual platform with no other person on the end, and the students just having talked to a screen about themselves. And to the company, they're like, oh, this is great because it makes us get through a lot of things quick without taking time. And then to the students, they're like, this sucks. Do they actually care about me as a person? Because they're not getting to know me right now. So yeah, I would definitely agree.
Well, and to your point, so this is where we're going to kind of get to have some discussion, but these are some tips that the students have kind of been aiming in our direction over many, many conversations with one-on-one with Cole in his office and with me in small groups and with our faculty. And I won't read through all of them, but I just want to hit some highlights. On the recruiting front, it seems incredibly important that the people in the room today know that your Glassdoor image is really making an impact with the Gen Zs. They are. If you're not familiar with Glassdoor, it's a I don't know what you would exactly call it, an internet company, I suppose, that speaks to internal company reputation and the way that you're seen by your own employees. And if you're not managing that image pretty proactively, the Z generation is picking up on it, and they're discussing it, and they're reviewing you and rating you, and they're actually warning people off of taking certain positions and things of that nature. So you have to kind of be careful about that, because Glassdoor is a real thing and it is really being used by this generation. You should be ready for Z a little earlier than you may expect. Some of them are finishing college. Most of them are finishing college right now, but there's a movement of them, and there's talk among them about either doing 2 years of community college and 2 quick years of bachelor's to get out and get there, or maybe even avoiding debt by not even completing college and going to start their own business. And so that's going to be a factor when we begin to compete for them, because not as many of them are going to probably graduate from college 7 or 8 years from now. So we're having to think about their debt avoidance strategy. They're trying to avoid that debt that Generation Y took on. One of the ways they're doing is starting businesses during college and then going off and doing their own thing. And so that's very different for people in my business who are very used to kind of the traditional model of educate and then go to work. And then things like progressive benefits, they value at the workplace free food, a freewheeling lifestyle where the dog can come to work, and what their out group is getting is a signal to them. They talk to each other constantly, and if across organizations those benefits aren't level, they're pretty quick to hop jobs and go to the next one. So oozing technology is a big thing for them, and entrepreneurship, which means essentially letting them move into the organization and start their own little business inside by making proposals to upper management and then running with their own ideas is a big thing for them. So our advice on recruiting is communicating like one of them, texting them rather than calling or writing an email. They don't really particularly want to read an email right now. I will often email a student and get something back 3 to 5 days later, but they will give you their phone number, and if you text them, they immediately reply. And they want to interview face-to-face versus Skype or Zoom, but then once they've interviewed, they want to go off and do their own thing, and you can reply by text from that point on. So just some thoughts about recruitment. And in terms of retention, I won't go long there either, but it's about promoting diversity and inclusion. As Cole said a moment ago, that's really the big push for them. Prioritizing personal and professional development, and then of course rewarding their creativity. So we've got a few concluding thoughts, but I want to just go ahead and open it up, I think, to Q&A. Anything that anybody wants to ask us? I know we've kind of crammed a lot of info at you in this session, but it'd be good to know anything anybody's thinking about it, or if there's a question we can answer about Gen Z and their preferences, we'd be happy to take that.
Yep. So we have quite a few great questions in Q&A. For those of you in the audience, feel free to go on and upvote those or add any other questions that you'd like. Chad, to start off, how can we train boomers and Gen Xers to better understand Gen Z?
Yeah, it's a fabulous question. So the thing about Gen Z that strikes me is because many of them are still in high school, we don't exactly know their workplace behaviors yet. We don't know their workplace preferences. But what we know early on is that doing a little bit of reverse mentoring is a great idea. Reverse mentoring, if you're not familiar with it, is the idea of having the Gen Zs effectively mentor their more senior peers on what are things being preferred in the workplace organization, what are the types of rewards, what are the types of work systems. Would they rather have an office, or would they rather perhaps not have an office and work remotely at all times, but be local and willing to come in to do meetings? I'm discovering that right now, even with some of our late Gen Y employees here. So it's a good question, and I think reverse mentoring is probably a key, Cole.
Yeah, and I know I've seen Caterpillar does a really great job of that,
Yes.
where they'll pair young professionals with people who are established in their career, just to be able to have them train both ways. And I think there's a lot of value in that for sure. Speaking of working remotely or being more flexible, so Ted's asking, given the increasing desire of Gen X and Gen Z employees to have flexibility in their schedules, and particularly in light of remote working due to COVID-19, how do you ensure that new employees are onboarded and familiarized with culture, work routines, and expectations?
Yeah, and that one also kind of dovetails with the one that follows it about the economic downturn. So as we begin to understand what telework really is beginning to look like, I think we're actually even hearing now that a lot of Gen X and Gen Y are beginning to press their organizations for more and more telework. But it's hard to create a company culture over telework. And so what companies right now are trying to do is they're trying to strike a balance between telework and in-person work that's sensible and creates the right amount of connectivity while at the same time allows for the freedom that those employees want to have in their lifestyles. So what it really comes down to is that Gen Z especially doesn't really separate work time from play time. They integrate work and life. And so it's perfectly okay for them to be asked to do something at 9 p.m. and they don't mind it. But that comes with the cost of, they also expect that if they want to go to the gym at 10 a.m., they can do it. And so that's the hardest part of this, is that we don't know yet what that mix needs to look like. We just need to know it. We just need it to be an 18 to 24 hour mix each day that's part work, part play, and that work and play are integrated in the way that makes that person working there most effective. Mm-hmm. That to me is the big answer there.
Yeah.
I'm seeing one more here that I want to go ahead and hit before we get the hook, and that is spoken as a boomer. Shouldn't we also expect Gen Z to adapt to the existing culture? I guess that was my initial inclination too, when I started thinking about this. But as I have learned more about Gen Z, what I've learned is that they don't believe that they have to adapt very much at all. In fact, one of the things that they will openly tell you is that if I find a workplace environment that doesn't have the culture I want, financial need will not stop me from moving. I will actually hang out my own shingle and do my own thing, or I will look immediately for another place to go. And so, in my mind, Cole, what do you think about this? But I think in my mind, my reaction to this question is, it might put a company at a competitive disadvantage to have a heavy culture. But that's just my take. And maybe this is the last question we have time for. But what's your thought on it?
I mean, I think culture brings people in, though, which is one of the hard things. I think it's just that you have to be willing to let your culture change. And that's the hard part. So, I mean, there are obviously really positive parts of culture that are just like really, really great things to do. I know I was really impressed when I went and visited the Chick-fil-A headquarters, and they really push that you take a lunch break at lunch so that like you're with other coworkers and stuff. And obviously that's an awesome part of culture. And it might be something that like a Gen Z person would be like, well, I might want to work through lunch so I can go and do this other thing later. But I think just being willing to listen to what your employees have to say, because otherwise you won't retain them. And that's the thing. If you won't ever let your culture change, then you won't be bringing in other perspectives.
So we have two from Justin and from Gerardo that I would have liked to get to, but I think what we want to do is I'm going to reply to those people individually. We are kind of hitting our end of time, but I'd like to kick it back to Mary Long. Thanks, Mary, for letting us do this. I think we maybe have opened a can of worms, and now the worms are still in the can, but I guess we'll see.
Thanks, Chad and Cole. This is great. Obviously, there is a lot of interest in this area, so thanks for the offer to follow up, and we'll get this out as well in recap on the webinar. So so Hannah's launching a poll. What we want to do, these things only get better if we get your feedback. So if you wouldn't mind taking a quick moment to give us feedback on this poll relative to how this resonated with you. And I will jump back to Chad and Cole. They're going to save one final question to get to at the end. So please stay on to listen to that. And then part of this, these events don't happen without a lot of behind the scenes effort. So I really want to thank our invisible co-host, Hannah Kirby, and our marketing director, Michelle Painter. Tomorrow, you'll get an email with the links to this recording and the other two recordings in our series, our summer series, Agility and the Triage from New Abnormal with Mary Holcomb and Wendy Tate, and Agility was with Tom Goldsby and Ted Stang. So thank you so much for being a part of this. We really look forward to seeing you all at our Fall Forum, and that will stretch from October 12th through November 12th. And Hannah's going to do a quick screen share here of the speakers that we have lined up for you. And you will also get a copy of this in the email that we send, just so that you can have a snapshot picture. But we've got Kate McTassick kicking us off, along with Elijah Ray. to take us through what the next phase of relationship contracting and vested looks like, as well as David Morgan and Kevin O'Meara from Shaw, Janet Duffy from Lockheed Martin, and our closing keynote speaker will be Greg Smith, the EVP at Walmart. So thanks everyone on this. And Chad and Cole, I'm going to send it back to you for one last question.
Awesome. Thank you, Mary. So yeah, before we close out, I'd love to get to Justin's question. So he asked, what feedback do you have on the hybrid generations, for example, Gen X, Y, seeing much more of that blended driving? How do they engage with the current and future workforces?
What's interesting about that one is I have seen little bits and pieces of research on this that suggest that people that are on the cusp of X, Y have got an unusual amount of leadership capability in many organizations right now, because X and Y were so polarized and opposite in their development that somebody that has a kind of a mutual understanding of both of those is often somebody that can really begin to kind of command and lead people in an unusually good way. But you don't have to be an XY cusp to be an excellent leader. One of the things you just have to do is have great empathy for the other group. And so, as Justin is asking here, how do we blend that to engage the current and future workforce? I think what it becomes is a need to become sensitive to the emerging generation without completely throwing away your organization's core values. And so whoever you are, whatever your organization's values are, if you can begin to understand what Z is, it doesn't mean make all your senior managers act like Gen Z. What it means is begin to think of things like motivation and compensation and begin to think about job design through the eyes of Z. Mm-hmm. And that's what's going to cause them to retain, and it's going to lower your hiring costs, make your talent supply chain more efficient. You don't have to become Z. You have to understand what Z is looking for and then strategically react to different elements of Z's overall sociological profile. And if you can do that, I think you're in a really good place. Justin, that's a great question. Thanks for that.
Yeah, and I think too, a lot of the young professionals that have entered into companies over the last 2 to 3 years are on the cusp of Y and Z. And so I'm sure they have a lot of great perspective that they can contribute to their companies now to help them develop those strategies for reaching out to Gen Z and understanding them a little bit better.
All right, well, I think we have accomplished the mission today. At least Mary seems to be saying we have. Everybody, it's been great to have a chance to talk to you. And of course, please come to the Supply Chain Forum. As Mary said, we love seeing your faces, even if they're on screens, but hopefully we'll have one of those live sometime in the near future. I, as a department head of this organization, truly believe in what we do there. And I believe that our faculty are world-class and they're the ones you ought to be coming to listen to. And so hopefully you can come talk to them, you can interact, meet our students, and then most importantly, interact with each other. Because the reason the forum is so great is because it is a forum. It's a chance for us to meet our peers and see all the great things that are happening in other companies, and then take some of that home and use it on Monday morning. So just glad to have had this chance. So thanks to Cole and thanks to Mary.
Awesome. Thank you.
Thanks everyone. I'm so glad that you were able to join us today, and look in your email for the follow-ups from this. Thanks so much. Bye now.